The bells of Hagia Sophia had fallen silent. For 11 centuries, their bronze voices had called the faithful to prayer, marking the hours of an empire that claimed inheritance from Rome itself. Now, in the pre-dawn darkness of May 30th, 1453, smoke still rose from the greatest city in the Eastern world. Constantinople, the queen of cities, had fallen after a siege that shook the earth with cannon fire and the screams of the dying. But this isn't a story about the fall of walls or the clash of armies. This is about what happened after the conquest ended, when the bloodlust faded and a young sultan faced a choice that would reveal something darker than battlefield brutality. Something that challenged every expectation of medieval warfare and exposed truths that both Islamic and Christian chroniclers would spend centuries trying to bury. In the ruins of the imperial palace, among shattered mosaics and blood-stained marble, several young women waited for their fate. They were the last daughters of Byzantium, princesses of a dynasty that traced its lineage back to the ancient Caesars. Their world had ended in a single morning of violence, but their ordeal was just beginning. What Sultan Mehmed II would do to these royal captives defied every law of conquest known to the medieval world. The official histories tell sanitized tales of military triumph and political necessity. But the truth, preserved in fragments of testimony and coded diplomatic letters, reveals something far more complex and infinitely more disturbing. Because sometimes the most terrifying aspect of conquest isn't the brutality you expect. It's the mercy that follows, and the price that mercy demands. On the morning after Constantinople fell, the imperial palace stood as a monument to devastation. Ottoman soldiers had swept through its marble corridors like a human flood, tearing down crosses, smashing centuries-old icons, and hunting for the treasures that had made Byzantium legendary. The air still reeked of smoke and spilled blood. Broken glass from stained windows crunched underfoot. Tapestries worth kingdoms lay trampled and torn. In this chaos, Ottoman commanders conducted their most important business: the systematic cataloguing of human plunder. Islamic law was clear about the spoils of war. After a city fell by force rather than surrender, the victorious army earned 3 days to claim whatever they desired. Soldiers selected the strongest men for labor, the most beautiful women for concubines, and children who could be trained in Ottoman ways. But the imperial family required special attention. These weren't common captives to be distributed among the troops. These were symbols of the conquered empire, living embodiments of defeated legitimacy. Their fate would send a message that echoed across Europe and the Islamic world. The surviving Paleologus women had spent their final free night in terror, listening to the sounds of their city dying. Some had attempted disguises, dressing as servants or covering their faces with kitchen soot. Others had hidden in cisterns, storage rooms, or secret passages built during previous sieges. A few had chosen suicide rather than face capture, but most were found, identified by their refined voices, soft hands, or the unconscious bearing that marked noble birth. Princess Anna Paleologus, 19 years old and unmarried, was discovered in the palace scriptorium, where she had been copying religious manuscripts. Her fingers were still stained with ink when Ottoman soldiers dragged her from behind overturned writing desks. She had been educated in Greek classics, Latin scripture, and Arabic poetry, skills that meant nothing when cannons reduced your walls to rubble. Princess Maria Paleologus, barely 16, was found hiding in the imperial kitchens wearing a cook's apron over her silk gown. She had torn her hands attempting to climb through a window too small for escape. Blood from her palms left red prints on the stone walls as soldiers led her away. The youngest was Princess Theodora, 15 years old, discovered in a storage chamber behind amphorae of olive oil. Her mother had cut her hair in rough chunks and dressed her in coarse wool, but her educated accent betrayed her royal blood the moment she spoke. She trembled as guards escorted her through corridors where she had once danced at court celebrations. These young women, along with several female cousins of the imperial line, were assembled in what remained of the throne room. The great hall where Byzantine emperors had received ambassadors from across the known world now served as a sorting ground for human cargo. Portable thrones had been arranged for Ottoman officials. Lists were compiled. Decisions were made about who would be sent where and for what purpose. Standard procedure dictated that noble women would become concubines for high-ranking Ottoman officials. The most beautiful might be selected for the Sultan's own harem. Others would be married to Ottoman nobles to cement political alliances. Some might be sold in slave markets from Cairo to Crimea, their royal blood making them particularly valuable commodities. The Byzantine princesses understood this. They had grown up hearing stories of other conquered cities, other fallen dynasties. They knew what happened to the daughters of defeated enemies. The terror in their eyes as they waited in that ruined throne room came not from uncertainty, but from knowledge. They knew exactly what fate awaited them. But Sultan Mehmed II was not a standard conqueror. At 21 years old, he carried ambitions that stretched far beyond military victory. He didn't merely want to capture Constantinople. He wanted to become Constantinople, to transform himself from a Turkic warlord into the legitimate heir of Roman imperial authority. This transformation required something his generals couldn't understand. It required a different relationship with the conquered population. Mehmed had studied the classics obsessively. He spoke Greek, Latin, Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and Serbian. He could quote Homer and discuss Byzantine theology with Orthodox priests. His library contained works by Aristotle and Plato alongside Islamic scholars. This wasn't mere intellectual curiosity. This was strategic preparation for the role he intended to claim. When the Sultan entered the throne room to examine the captured princesses, he brought with him an understanding of Roman imperial precedent that shaped every decision. Augustus had married his daughter to Marcus Agrippa to strengthen political bonds. Constantine had elevated Christians to positions of authority to unify his empire. Justinian had married Theodora, a woman of humble birth, to demonstrate imperial accessibility. Mehmed saw the Paleologus women not merely as captives, but as potential instruments of legitimacy. Their bloodline connected them to Constantine the Great, to Justinian, to the long succession of rulers who had governed from this very palace. In the medieval world, bloodline mattered more than conquest. A throne seized by force remained unstable until blessed by continuity with the past. The chronicles describe the moment when Mehmed first addressed the princesses in fluent Greek. His words were carefully chosen, deliberately formal, employing the ancient protocols of Byzantine court ceremony. He acknowledged their royal status, inquired about their education, and asked detailed questions about their knowledge of imperial administration. Princess Anna, the eldest, answered with remarkable composure despite her circumstances. She had studied the administrative systems of previous emperors. She could read and write in multiple languages. She understood the complex relationships between church and state that had governed Byzantine politics for centuries. Her responses revealed not just noble breeding, but genuine intellectual capability. Princess Maria spoke of her knowledge of religious customs and her familiarity with the theological disputes that had shaped Orthodox Christianity. Despite her youth, she demonstrated understanding of the doctrinal complexities that had defined Byzantine spiritual life. Princess Theodora, though clearly terrified, showed surprising insight into the cultural traditions that had made Constantinople a bridge between East and West. Her education had encompassed not just Christian theology, but also Islamic philosophy and classical Greek literature. These were not merely beautiful ornaments to decorate a harem. These were educated women who understood the civilization they represented, who could serve as bridges between the conquered and conquering peoples. In their knowledge, Mehmed saw opportunity. In their bloodline, he saw legitimacy. In their survival, He saw the foundation for something unprecedented in the history of Islamic conquest. But his commanders saw only tradition. They expected distribution of the royal women according to established precedent. They had fought for 57 days to breach these walls. They had earned their rewards according to the laws of war and the customs of victory. The Sultan's unusual interest in the educational qualifications of his captives made them uncomfortable. The tension in that throne room was palpable as two different visions of conquest competed. The generals wanted plunder, slaves, and the complete humiliation of their enemies. Mehmed wanted transformation, legitimacy, and the creation of an empire that could absorb and transcend what it conquered. The fate of 3 terrified young women would determine which vision prevailed. What happened next would be so unprecedented that chroniclers on both sides would struggle to explain it. Christian historians would bury the details because they complicated narratives of Ottoman brutality. Islamic historians would minimize the events because they suggested uncomfortable complexity in their sultan's character. The truth would survive only in fragments scattered across archives and diplomatic correspondence, waiting centuries to be reconstructed. The decision Mehmed made about the Paleologos princesses would reveal something about the nature of power that neither side wanted history to remember, because sometimes the most terrifying aspect of conquest isn't what the victors take, it's what they choose to preserve and why. The silence stretched across the marble floor like spilled blood. Sultan Mehmed II studied the 3 princesses with eyes that had witnessed the destruction of empires, calculating something his generals couldn't fathom. Outside, the screams of Constantinople's final agony still echoed through broken windows. But inside this ruined throne room, a different kind of violence was taking shape. The kind that wore the mask of mercy. Princess Anna lifted her chin with desperate dignity, meeting the Sultan's gaze despite knowing it could cost her life. Medieval protocol demanded she prostrate herself before the conqueror, but something in Mehmed's expression suggested different rules were being written. When he spoke again, his Greek was flawless, carrying the accent of educated Constantinople rather than the court of Adrianople. "You have studied the administrative codes of Justinian," he said, not asking but stating. "You understand the principles that governed this empire for 1,000 years. Anna's voice trembled only slightly when she replied, "I have read the Basilica and the Ecloga, my lord. I know the laws that once ruled from these halls." What followed was an examination unlike anything recorded in the annals of medieval conquest. For 2 hours, as smoke continued rising from the burning city, the Sultan of the Ottomans conducted what could only be described as an academic interview with the daughters of his greatest enemies. He questioned them about theology, philosophy, statecraft, and the intricate ceremonials that had defined Byzantine imperial authority. These weren't the questions of a conqueror selecting concubines. These were the inquiries of a ruler seeking collaborators. But collaboration in what? His generals exchanged glances that spoke of growing unease. The laws of war were clear. The customs of victory were established. Yet their sultan seemed more interested in the intellectual qualifications of his captives than their physical attributes. Princess Maria, barely 16 but educated beyond her years, found herself discussing the theological controversies that had split the Orthodox Church. Her knowledge of the Filioque dispute and the complexities of iconoclastic debates impressed even the Islamic scholars in Mehmed's retinue. Here was a Christian princess who understood the very doctrinal questions that had shaped relations between Constantinople and Rome for centuries. Princess Theodora, youngest of the 3, demonstrated familiarity with Islamic philosophy that startled the Sultan's advisors. Her tutors had been progressive, teaching her not just Christian theology, but the works of Averroes and Avicenna. In the ruins of her empire, she could quote Islamic scholars with an accuracy that made Ottoman clerics nod in grudging approval. But beneath this scholarly discourse lay currents of terror that no amount of intellectual conversation could disguise. The princesses understood they were performing for their lives. Every answer was a gamble. Every demonstration of knowledge, a desperate bid to prove their value beyond the obvious uses to which captive royal women were typically subjected. They spoke with the fluency of the educated and the desperation of the doomed. Mehmed's questions grew more specific, more pointed. He wanted to know about the administrative structures that had kept Constantinople functioning, even as the empire crumbled around it. How were taxes collected from the remaining provinces? What relationships existed between the imperial court and the various Orthodox communities scattered across Ottoman-threatened territories? Which families retained influence among the Greek population? These weren't academic inquiries. These were the questions of a ruler planning not destruction, but absorption. The Sultan was mapping the human infrastructure of the empire he had conquered, identifying the people and relationships that could serve his broader ambitions. And in the Paleologous princesses, he was discovering something unexpected. Potential administrators who understood both the conquered and conquering systems. His Grand Vizier, Halil Pasha, watched this extraordinary scene with growing alarm. The old advisor had served Mehmed's father and understood the dangers of innovation in the aftermath of conquest. Armies expected rewards. Soldiers demanded their traditional shares of plunder. To deny them the distribution of royal captives according to established custom risked mutiny at the moment of greatest triumph. But Mehmed seemed oblivious to such concerns, lost in his vision of imperial transformation. When Princess Anna demonstrated her knowledge of Byzantine diplomatic protocols, explaining the complex ceremonials used to receive foreign ambassadors, the Sultan's interest intensified. Here was someone who could teach him not just the mechanics of ruling Constantinople, but the subtle arts of claiming legitimacy in the eyes of European courts. The interrogation revealed something else that disturbed his commanders. These young women, despite their terror, showed no inclination toward conversion to Islam. They answered questions about Islamic philosophy with scholarly precision, but their Christian faith remained unshaken. In the traditional understanding of conquest, this would make them unsuitable for integration into Ottoman court life. Concubines were expected to convert. Administrative wives were required to embrace their husband's religion. Yet Mehmed seemed unconcerned by their religious steadfastness. If anything, their unwavering Christianity appeared to intrigue him further. Perhaps he understood something his advisors missed, that to claim legitimacy as the heir to Roman imperial authority, he needed continuity with Christian traditions as well as Islamic ones. The Byzantine Empire had been fundamentally Christian for over a millennium. To rule its people effectively might require preserving rather than destroying their spiritual leadership. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the blood-stained marble, the Sultan reached his decision. But before announcing it, he dismissed his military commanders and most of his court officials. Only his closest advisors remained to witness what would become one of history's most controversial acts of conquest. The princesses knelt before the portable throne, still wearing their makeshift disguises, still stained with the soot and tears of their city's destruction. They had performed admirably in their desperate audition for survival, demonstrating intellectual gifts that exceeded many of the Sultan's own courtiers. But education alone couldn't explain what happened next. Mehmed rose from his throne and walked to a window overlooking the Golden Horn, where Ottoman ships crowded the harbour like predatory birds. The city he had dreamed of conquering since childhood lay spread before him, wounded but not destroyed, burning but not consumed. In claiming Constantinople, he had fulfilled the prophecies that promised divine favour to the ruler who would unite the Islamic world under a single banner. But prophecy was only the beginning. To truly become Caesar, to legitimately claim inheritance from Augustus and Constantine, he needed more than military victory. He needed transformation, both of himself and of the empire he now ruled. And transformation required something his generals couldn't provide: the willing cooperation of the conquered population. When he turned back to face the kneeling princesses, His expression had hardened into something that would haunt chroniclers for centuries. This wasn't the face of a brutal conqueror claiming his spoils. This wasn't the expression of a young man selecting beautiful additions to his harem. This was the calculating gaze of a ruler who had just conceived a plan so audacious, so unprecedented, that it would challenge every assumption about the nature of Islamic conquest. The decision, he announced, would transform these three terrified young women from victims into something far more complex and dangerous. They would become living bridges between the Christian and Islamic worlds, symbols of a new kind of empire that absorbed rather than destroyed what it conquered. But bridges, by their very nature, are precarious things. They connect two shores while belonging fully to neither. What Sultan Mehmed II offered the Paleologos princesses wasn't salvation. It was survival at a price that would test their faith, their loyalty, and their understanding of what it meant to serve an empire built on the bones of their ancestors. The terror they felt in that moment came not from the brutality they expected, but from the mercy they were about to receive and the obligations that mercy would demand. In the gathering dusk of that blood-soaked day, as Constantinople burned around them, three young women learned that sometimes the most frightening fate isn't death or slavery. Sometimes it's being chosen to live and discovering what that choice will cost not just themselves, but everyone they claim to represent. The words that fell from Sultan Mehmed's lips would echo through history like the crack of splitting stone, not because of their volume, but because of their impossible meaning. In that ruined throne room, surrounded by the debris of a 1,000-year empire, he spoke a sentence that defied every law of medieval conquest. "You will not be distributed among my officers. You will not enter my harem. You will not be sold in the slave markets of Cairo or Damascus." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the distant sounds of the city's agony seemed to pause, as if the very air struggled to process what had been spoken. Princess Anna's eyes widened in confusion rather than relief. This wasn't mercy as she understood it. This was something else entirely, something that made her skin crawl with anticipation of horrors yet unnamed. Grand Vizier Halil Pasha stepped forward, his weathered face creased with alarm. "My Sultan, the law is clear. The spoils of conquest belong to those who shed blood for victory. The Janissaries expect their rewards. The Sipahi cavalry have earned their shares. To deny them the distribution of royal captives violates every precedent of Islamic warfare." Mehmed's gaze never left the kneeling princesses. The law serves the state, not the reverse. These women possess knowledge more valuable than their bodies. They understand systems of governance that took centuries to develop. They represent bloodlines that European courts recognize as legitimate. They are tools of empire, not trinkets for soldiers. But tools for what purpose? The question hung in the air like incense smoke, heavy with implications that none dared voice. Princess Maria felt bile rise in her throat as understanding began to dawn. The Sultan wasn't offering them freedom. He was offering them a different kind of captivity, one that might prove far more terrible than anything his generals had planned. "You will be housed in quarters befitting your former rank," Mehmed continued, his voice carrying the mechanical precision of a man implementing a long-contemplated strategy. "You will be provided with tutors to expand your knowledge of Ottoman administrative practices. You will learn Turkish and Persian in addition to the languages you already command. You will study Islamic law and Christian theology with equal dedication." Princess Theodora's voice cracked when she finally found the courage to speak. "What service do you require of us, my lord?" The Sultan's smile was cold as winter stone. "You will help me become what this empire needs, not merely its conqueror, but its legitimate heir. You will teach me the ceremonies that made Byzantine emperors sacred in the eyes of their subjects. You will explain the traditions that bound church and state in harmonious cooperation. You will demonstrate how Christian and Islamic principles can coexist within a single administrative framework. The true horror of his plan began to crystallize in the minds of everyone present. Mehmed wasn't simply preserving these women as curiosities or symbols. He was conscripting them as collaborators in the transformation of their own civilization. They would be forced to participate in the systematic absorption of Byzantine culture into Ottoman imperial structure, teaching their conqueror how to wear the mantle of their ancestors while serving the interests of their enemies. And if we refuse? Princess Anna's question emerged as barely a whisper. Then you will join the thousands already sold in the markets of Bursa and Ankara, came the reply. Your knowledge will die with your empire, and your bloodline will vanish into the anonymous multitudes of the enslaved. The choice, such as it is, remains yours. This was the true genius of his cruelty, not the brutality of immediate execution or the humiliation of sexual slavery, but the slow corruption of identity itself. These women would live, but only by becoming instruments in the destruction of everything they had been raised to protect and preserve. They would survive by teaching their enemy how to legitimately claim their ancestors' throne. The psychological torture was exquisite in its complexity. To refuse meant certain death or slavery for themselves, and likely execution for any remaining family members. To accept meant becoming willing participants in the transformation of Byzantium into a province of the Ottoman Empire. They would watch their faith, their culture, and their political traditions gradually absorbed into the expanding Islamic world system. And they would be the ones providing the knowledge that made this absorption possible. Grand Vizier Halil Pasha understood the implications better than most. My Sultan, the risks of this course are enormous. To preserve Christian nobility within the court invites accusations of heterodoxy from our own religious authorities. The ulama will question your commitment to Islamic principles. Your own janissaries may see this as favoritism toward the conquered population. The ulama will be satisfied when they see how effectively these women can facilitate conversion among the Greek population, Mehmed replied. Who better to explain the compatibility of Christian and Islamic values than educated Christian women who have embraced service to an Islamic ruler? And the janissaries will be content with the wealth and territory this strategy will ultimately deliver. The Sultan's vision was breathtaking in its ambition and terrifying in its implications. He wasn't simply conquering territory, he was engineering cultural synthesis on a scale never before attempted. The Paleologous princesses would become living examples of how Christian nobility could find honor in Ottoman service, encouraging other Byzantine families to collaborate rather than resist. But the psychological cost of this collaboration would be immense. These women would be required to attend Islamic court ceremonies while maintaining their Christian faith. They would need to demonstrate respect for Islamic law while preserving their knowledge of Byzantine legal traditions. They would be expected to facilitate marriages between Ottoman nobles and remaining Byzantine aristocrats, essentially orchestrating the genetic and cultural merger of two civilizations. Princess Maria began to weep silently, understanding finally that death might have been the kinder option. To die as a martyr for her faith and empire would have been horrible but comprehensible. To live as an instrument of her empire's transformation into something unrecognizable was a fate that challenged her understanding of honor, duty, and survival itself. There is more, the Sultan continued, his voice growing softer but more menacing. You will be given estates in Anatolia, properties confiscated from rebellious Turkish nobles who opposed my reign. You will govern Christian populations in these territories, demonstrating how Byzantine administrative expertise can serve Ottoman imperial interests. Your success in these positions will determine not only your own fate, but the treatment of all remaining Christian nobility throughout the empire. The trap was complete. They would not simply be preserving their own lives through collaboration. They would be responsible for the welfare of every Christian family that remained within Ottoman territory. Their performance as imperial administrators would establish the precedent for how the conquered population would be treated for generations to come. Success would mean the gradual absorption of Christian communities into the Ottoman system. Failure would mean persecution and possibly genocide. "You have until dawn to consider my offer," Mehmed announced, rising from his portable throne. "Quarters have been prepared for you in the Tekfur Palace. Guards will ensure your safety during your deliberations. But understand this clearly. There will be no second opportunities, no renegotiation of terms. Accept my proposal and live as honored servants of the Ottoman state. Refuse and face the consequences that await all who resist the will of their sultan." As Ottoman soldiers escorted the three princesses from the ruined throne room, each step echoed with the weight of impossible choice. Behind them lay the shattered remnants of the only world they had ever known. Ahead stretched a future that promised survival at the cost of everything that had given their lives meaning. The night that followed would test their understanding of loyalty, faith, and survival in ways that no amount of royal education could have prepared them for. In the darkness of their temporary prison, three young women would wrestle with questions that had no good answers. What price was too high for life itself? Could honor survive collaboration with one's enemies? And was it possible to serve an empire built on the ruins of your own without losing your soul in the process? The Sultan's offer wasn't mercy. It was something far more sophisticated and infinitely more cruel. The opportunity to live by becoming willing participants in their own civilization's transformation. In the morning, they would discover what choice they could bear to make, and what that choice would cost not just themselves, but everyone who looked to them as the last representatives of a dying world. Dawn broke over Constantinople like blood seeping through bandages. The city that had awakened for 11 centuries to the sound of Christian bells now stirred to the call of muezzins, echoing from hastily converted minarets. In the Tekfur Palace, three young women sat in silence, watching shadows retreat across marble floors that had once reflected the glory of their ancestors. They had not slept. How could they? The choice before them defied every principle they had been raised to uphold. Yet refusal meant certain death for themselves and likely doom for every Christian family remaining in Ottoman territory. Princess Anna stared at her hands, soft and pale from a lifetime of privilege, wondering if they were strong enough to build bridges across the chasm between two civilizations. "We are the last," Princess Maria whispered, her voice barely audible in the pre-dawn quiet. "The final link between what was and what will be. If we die, that connection dies with us." Princess Theodora turned from the window where she had been watching Ottoman soldiers patrol the courtyard. "If we live as he demands, we become something else entirely. Neither Christian nor Muslim, neither Byzantine nor Ottoman. What are we then?" The question hung between them, like a blade suspended by silk thread. Outside, the sounds of a city learning to breathe under new masters filtered through broken shutters. Merchants calling prices in Turkish instead of Greek. Soldiers laughing in languages the princesses barely recognized. Children crying for parents who would never answer. Anna rose and began pacing, her mind working through calculations that had nothing to do with mathematics and everything to do with survival. "He doesn't want us to become Ottoman," she said finally. "He wants us to remain Byzantine enough to legitimize his rule, but Ottoman enough to serve his purposes. We would be living symbols of conquest that looks like cooperation." "Living lies," Maria corrected bitterly. "Living bridges," Theodora countered, though her voice carried no conviction. The debate that followed would have seemed surreal to anyone listening from outside. Three teenage girls, orphaned by conquest, discussing political philosophy and imperial strategy as if they were seasoned statesmen rather than captives facing an impossible choice. But their education had prepared them for exactly this kind of analysis. Even if it had never prepared them, for the emotional weight of applying such knowledge to their own survival. Anna outlined the strategic implications with disturbing clarity. If we accept, we become templates for how other Byzantine nobles should behave. Our success makes collaboration attractive. Our failure makes resistance seem pointless. And if we refuse, Maria asked, though she already knew the answer. We die as martyrs, but martyrdom serves no one if there's no one left to remember what we died for. The cruel mathematics of their situation allowed no clean choices. Refusal meant immediate death and the likely persecution of every Christian who might have looked to their example for guidance. Acceptance meant slow cultural suicide, the gradual erosion of everything that had made them who they were. But there was something else, something none of them wanted to acknowledge directly. In the Sultan's offer, they glimpsed possibilities that pure resistance could never provide. If they could maintain their faith while appearing to serve Ottoman interests, if they could protect Christian communities while seeming to facilitate their integration, if they could preserve Byzantine knowledge while teaching it to their conquerors, they might accomplish something unprecedented. They might survive not just as individuals, but as carriers of their civilization's deepest values into an uncertain future. He's brilliant, Anna admitted with grudging respect. By preserving us, he removes the martyrdom that might inspire resistance. By educating us in Ottoman ways, he ensures we become more valuable alive than dead. By giving us administrative responsibilities, he makes our success synonymous with his success. And by making us responsible for other Christians' welfare, he ensures we can never truly rebel. Theodora added, "Our defiance would cost not just our lives, but the lives of everyone who depends on our cooperation." The psychological architecture of their captivity was masterful in its complexity. They would be simultaneously prisoners and administrators, victims and collaborators, symbols of defeat and agents of integration. Every day would require them to navigate contradictions that had no resolution, to serve interests that fundamentally opposed their own, while maintaining enough of their identity to make that service valuable. Maria spoke the thought that haunted all three of them. What if we become so good at pretending to be Ottoman that we forget how to be Byzantine? The question struck at the heart of their terror. Not the fear of death, which would at least preserve their identity intact, but the fear of transformation so gradual and complete that they might one day wake up and discover they had become willing servants of their enemy's vision. The Sultan's cruelty lay not in destroying them, but in offering them survival at the cost of everything that made survival worthwhile. As morning light strengthened, casting geometric patterns through latticed windows, the sounds of the city grew more distinct. Hammers rang against stone as workers began repairs to damaged buildings. Voices called in multiple languages as merchants reopened their shops. Life was reasserting itself with the stubborn persistence that characterized human civilization. "Listen," Anna said suddenly. "Do you hear it?" The others strained to catch whatever had captured her attention. Beneath the obvious sounds of reconstruction, something else emerged. Faint but unmistakable, the sound of Greek being spoken in the streets below. Not the formal Greek of court ceremony, but the everyday dialect of common people going about their business. "They're still here," Maria breathed. "Our people are still here." "For now," Theodora replied grimly. "But for how long? And in what form?" The conversation that followed would determine not just their immediate fate, but the trajectory of Christian-Muslim relations in the Ottoman Empire for generations to come. They were three teenagers making decisions that would affect the lives of millions, and the weight of that responsibility pressed down on them like the stone ceiling of a collapsing building. Anna voiced what they all understood, but none had dared articulate. "We're going to accept, aren't we?" The admission hung in the air like smoke from extinguished candles. Not because they wanted to, not because they believed it was right, but because the alternative was unthinkable. They would collaborate not from conviction, but from the terrible mathematics of survival in a world where pure choices no longer existed. "God forgive us," Maria whispered. "Perhaps," Theodora replied. "God will understand." When Ottoman guards arrived to escort them back to the Sultan's presence, they found 3 young women who had aged decades in a single night. Their decision was written in their posture, in the set of their shoulders, in the way they walked toward a future that promised everything except the one thing they most desired: the right to remain who they had always been. The throne room had been cleaned during their absence, the broken mosaics swept away, the bloodstains scrubbed from marble floors, the shattered windows covered with silk curtains that filtered the morning light into something resembling peace. But the smell of smoke still lingered, and the missing pieces of decorative stonework served as permanent reminders of the violence that had preceded this moment of apparent civility. Sultan Mehmed sat waiting, no longer on a portable campaign throne, but on a chair of Byzantine manufacture, upholstered in Ottoman silk. The symbolism was unmistakable. He was already becoming what he claimed to be: the legitimate heir to Roman imperial authority, ruling from the palace of his predecessors while maintaining the forms and ceremonies that made such rule recognizable to his new subjects. "Your decision?" he asked, without preamble. Princess Anna stepped forward, speaking for all 3 with words that felt like stones in her throat. "We accept your offer, my lord. We place ourselves in your service and trust in your protection." The Sultan's smile held no warmth, only satisfaction at the successful completion of a complex negotiation. "Excellent! Your education begins immediately. Tutors have been selected to instruct you in Turkish, Persian, and Arabic. Islamic law and Ottoman administrative procedures will be added to your existing knowledge of Byzantine governance. You will attend court ceremonies to observe how imperial authority functions in practice." "And our faith?" Maria asked, her voice barely steady. "Will be respected, as long as it serves the interests of the state. You will worship as Christians, but you will demonstrate that Christian virtue is compatible with Ottoman service. Your example will encourage other believers to see cooperation rather than resistance as the path of wisdom." The terms were clear, the expectations explicit. They would be living advertisements for the benefits of submission, proof that conquered peoples could find honor and security within the Ottoman system. Their success would make future conquests easier by encouraging surrender rather than desperate resistance. But beneath the surface of this apparently straightforward arrangement lay complexities that none of them fully understood yet. They were entering a world where identity was fluid, where survival required constant adaptation, where the line between cooperation and collaboration shifted daily based on political necessity. "You will be given new names," the Sultan continued, "suitable for your positions within the Ottoman court. Princess Anna will become Hatice Hatun. Princess Maria will be known as Fatma Hatun. Princess Theodora will take the name Aishi Hatun." The names fell like tombstones across their identities. Hatice, Fatma, Aishi. Ottoman names that would be carved into history while their Christian souls rotted beneath layers of silk and submission. The last daughters of Byzantium had chosen survival, but survival in a form so twisted that death might have been the kinder master. What Sultan Mehmed II did to these princesses was indeed beyond terrifying, but not for the reasons you might expect. He didn't break their bodies or destroy their minds through brutality. Instead, he offered them something far more insidious: the chance to live by slowly murdering who they had been, to preserve themselves by becoming willing architects of their own civilization's absorption into the very empire that had destroyed it. The true horror wasn't in the choice they made, but in the fact that it was the only rational choice available. 3 teenage girls, faced with the mathematics of survival, chose to become living bridges between worlds rather than martyred symbols of resistance. They would spend the rest of their lives teaching their conqueror how to wear their ancestors' crown, while slowly forgetting the weight of their own. This is conquest at its most sophisticated and cruel. Not the simple brutality of sword and fire, but the patient corruption of identity itself. The Sultan's greatest victory wasn't taking Constantinople's walls, but convincing its last princesses to help him claim its soul.